He wrote her 365 letters, but she never opened a single one. Until today, Olivia stepped into the dimly lit attic, the air thick with the scent of dust and forgotten memories. She had always been curious about the things hidden away in the old house, but today, something felt different. As she wandered through the forgotten relics of the past, her eyes caught something unusual, a weathered wooden chest tucked away in the far corner. Its edges were worn, the wood cracked, and its lock rusted with age, but there was something strangely captivating about it. With trembling hands, Olivia approached, her heart racing with the anticipation of discovering what secrets it might hold. She crouched down, gently brushing the dust away, and examined the chest closer. The faint markings on its surface suggested it had been there for years, maybe even generations. What could be inside? Her mind raced with possibilities. A family heirloom? Old letters? Or perhaps something even more mysterious? She hesitated for just a moment before her curiosity got the best of her. She reached for the lock, and with one final push, it clicked open. With the lock now undone, Olivia slowly lifted the chest's heavy lid, the creak of old hinges echoing through the quiet attic. Her breath caught as she peered inside. Nestled among layers of aged fabric were 365 neatly stacked envelopes, each one carefully sealed with a red wax stamp. They were all dated, one for every day of the year. Each letter seemed to whisper a story, yet their mystery remained intact, untouched by time. Her fingers trembled as she gently pulled the top envelope free. The paper, though yellowed with age, was surprisingly sturdy. She traced the date on the front, April 14th, 1958, and then glanced at the next one in the pile. They were all dated, one after another, like a countdown to something she couldn't yet understand. Her heart beat faster with each letter she uncovered. Who wrote these? Who were they for? And most of all, why had they never been opened? The attic felt colder now, as if the letters themselves held a secret that was about to be revealed. Olivia's curiosity surged, but there was a deeper, more pressing question lingering in the air. What had kept these letters from being read? Olivia's hand hovered over the stack of letters, uncertainty pulling at her. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, the quiet attic suddenly heavy with expectation. Each letter seemed to beckon, urging her to uncover its contents, but something, some quiet, nagging voice, made her hesitate. What if the letters held something too personal, too raw? What if they weren't meant for her eyes? Her pulse quickened as she reached out, her fingers brushing the edges of the first letter. The delicate paper felt cool against her skin, and for a moment, she wondered if it was a mistake. But then, the anticipation took over. She couldn't leave them untouched, couldn't deny the pull of the past any longer. With a soft exhale, Olivia picked up the first letter, the seal still intact. The faint scent of ink and paper filled the air as she carefully turned it over in her hands. Her eyes scanned the date, her heart racing. She could feel her breath catch as she broke the wax seal, the sound oddly loud in the stillness of the attic. She unfolded the letter slowly, each crease of the paper echoing the weight of what was about to be revealed. As Olivia unfolded the letter, a quiet stillness settled around her. She felt as if time itself had slowed, the world outside the attic fading into nothingness. Her eyes began to scan the words, each sentence more poignant than the last. There were no grand gestures, no proclamations of love shouted from rooftops. Instead, it was a soft, steady rhythm, a love spoken in whispers, in moments that passed unnoticed by others. She couldn't help but feel a deep, inexplicable connection to the writer. The words spoke of patience, of waiting, of a love that endured despite distance and time. A love that wasn't always loud, but was always there, written in the spaces between the lines. As she continued to read, a voice echoed in her mind, as if speaking from the shadows of the past. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's written in silence. The words felt heavy in her chest, as if they had been waiting for someone to hear them, to understand, to finally open the chest and uncover the truth that had been locked away for so long. 5 years ago, the world was a little different. The hustle of life felt more manageable, the days somehow stretching longer, filled with endless possibility. Liam sat in a quiet corner of a small cafe, the soft hum of conversations around him barely reaching his ears. He wasn't one for crowds, but this place, the aroma of fresh coffee, the sound of clinking cups, felt like the perfect backdrop for what he was about to do. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook from his bag, the pages well-worn from the many thoughts scribbled in them over the years. His fingers hovered over the pen, as if searching for the right words, the ones that would finally capture everything he'd been feeling. The weight of his decision hung heavily in the air, a quiet pressure he couldn't shake. His gaze wandered out the window, watching the world go by. People hurried past, absorbed in their own lives, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding inside the cafe. His mind drifted to her, Sophie. He thought of her smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, the gentle way she spoke about the simplest things as if they were treasures. She had always been a mystery, an enigma he had never quite figured out. And yet, there he was, about to send his heart to her in the form of a letter. With a deep breath, he began to write. Sophie, he wrote, the pen moving steadily across the paper, each word feeling like a quiet confession. There are things we never say aloud, things we keep locked away. But I can't keep this inside any longer. I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you'll understand, but I have to tell you. You've changed everything for me, and I don't think I'll ever be the same. The words flowed as though they had been waiting inside him for years, desperate to be set free. He paused, glancing down at the letter, wondering if it was enough, if it was what he truly wanted to say. But there was no time for second-guessing. He folded the letter carefully, sealing it with a single, deliberate stroke of the pen. Liam sat back in his chair, staring at the envelope now resting in front of him. He had taken the first step, but he wasn't sure if it was the right one. He only knew one thing. He had written his heart down, and now, all he could do was wait for her to understand, to read his words and, perhaps, realize the depth of what he had felt all along. With one last glance out the window, Liam tucked the letter into his coat pocket, ready to send it off, knowing that, in some small way, he had already given her a piece of himself. Liam sat in the cafe, the letter in his hands now feeling heavier than he expected. The words had poured out of him with such urgency, and yet, now that it was done, there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the weight of what he had just done was sinking in. His heart was racing, but his mind was eerily calm. He took a deep breath and carefully folded the letter, the edges crisp and precise. With a steady hand, he picked up the wax seal and pressed it onto the envelope, the deep red marking it with a finality he couldn't undo. It wasn't just any letter. It was his heart, sealed in the most fragile way, bound to a moment he couldn't take back. Liam glanced down at the envelope, his eyes tracing the words he had written. But there was more. A decision that would stretch far beyond today, far beyond this single letter. He picked up his pen again, the tip of it scratching against the paper as he wrote one last line. Simple but significant. Day 1. It was a mark of something new, something unspoken. This wasn't the beginning of a conversation, but the start of something far more meaningful, an expression that might never reach her, yet would always remain his. The words felt like a promise, a quiet commitment to something unknown, yet certain. There would be more letters to come, each one tied to a moment, a memory, a feeling. But for now, this one, Day 1, was the first step. Liam slid the envelope into his coat pocket, his fingers lingering on the wax seal for a moment longer than he intended. His chest tightened with a mixture of fear and hope, but there was no turning back now. The letter, like his heart, was sealed and sent into the unknown. The days passed in a blur, each one bleeding into the next as Liam kept to the routine he had set for himself. Writing, always writing. His pen became an extension of him, a tool through which he poured his thoughts, his hopes, his quiet longing. Each morning, he would sit at his kitchen table, the early light filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the room. He would grab the same notebook, the pages now thick with words, and begin. The dates stacked up, each one marked with a new letter, a new attempt to convey the feelings he had never found the courage to voice aloud. There were days when the rain poured relentlessly, dark clouds swallowing the sky, and he would write by the dim glow of a single lamp, his words dancing across the paper like whispers in the storm. Other days, the sun would shine brightly, and he would write outside, the warmth of the world reflecting in his thoughts, but still, there was always that underlying current of uncertainty. Would she ever read them? Would she ever understand? Rain or shine, Liam wrote. On days when the world felt heavy, when his thoughts were muddled with doubt, he would scribble with urgency, as though the ink on the page might carry away the weight in his chest. On the brighter days, when a flicker of hope would sneak in, his letters were filled with a tenderness that mirrored the soft warmth of the sun. He didn't need to ask if it was enough. The act of writing was enough. He poured his heart out, one letter at a time, day after day. Each one a piece of himself, a quiet testament to something that existed only between the lines. Sometimes, after the ink had dried, he would look at the stack of letters sitting beside him, all sealed with the same red wax. Day 45, Day 112, Day 203. They all sat there, waiting, a silent promise that no matter what the days brought, Liam would continue. The world may have kept moving around him, but this was something constant, something he could control. The letters piled up, one for each passing day, each one a reminder that, no matter how far the distance, no matter how long the wait, he had given her something that could never be taken away. Liam sat at his desk, the world outside fading away as he stared at the blank page before him. His fingers gripped the pen, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him like a quiet storm. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few distant murmurs, but inside, everything was still. His heart raced as he put the pen to paper, knowing this might be the first and only time he'd ever say these words. Olivia, he wrote, the name feeling foreign yet familiar on his lips. He paused for a moment, trying to find the right way to start, the right way to explain everything that had been bottled up inside of him for so long. There was no grand introduction, no explanation of why he was writing. He simply had to say it. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I miss you. The words felt heavy as they left his hand, almost as though they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. He didn't know if she would ever see them, if she would ever understand the depths of his longing. But it didn't matter. In that moment, the simple act of writing them down felt like the only thing he could do to release the ache in his chest. Liam leaned back in his chair, staring at the words as they stared back at him. He didn't need to explain more. The truth was already on the page, raw, honest, and unfiltered. As Olivia continued to read through the letters, one by one, she felt an unfamiliar weight settle over her. At first, she had simply been curious, intrigued by the stack of unopened messages that had been tucked away for so many years. But with each letter, a shift began to happen within her. The words were so simple, yet so deeply personal, each one echoing the longing and vulnerability of a heart laid bare. The ink bled into the pages like memories, drawing her deeper into the past, into a place where time had stood still. The letters spoke of missed moments, quiet regrets, and an unspoken love that had never quite found its voice until now. As she read, she could almost feel the weight of each word as if it were a direct transmission of emotions, reaching across the years to find her in the present. Liam's words weren't just ink on paper. They were his heart, his longing, his quiet ache. I miss you, he had written in the first letter, and with each subsequent note, that sentiment deepened. There were promises he'd made to himself, little hopes that had never been realized, but they were all wrapped in a tenderness that she hadn't expected. Her chest tightened as she read another. Every day without you feels like a year. I can't stop wondering what could have been. The words lingered in her mind, haunting her, stirring up emotions she had buried for so long. She had never truly understood the weight of his silence, the distance he had kept. But now, as she read each letter, the puzzle pieces were falling into place. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read more, letters filled with pain, with longing, with a hope that had never fully died. She hadn't realized how much she had missed him, how much she had taken for granted. The quiet ache that had been her constant companion seemed to mirror his words, and in that moment, Olivia understood something deeper. There had been love here, in every corner, every unspoken glance, every chance not taken. The floodgates opened, and emotions surfaced like waves crashing against the shore, unrelenting and raw. The letters had become more than just ink on paper. They were a window into a heart she had never fully known. The memory hit Olivia like a wave, sharp, sudden, and unforgiving. It was a night she would never forget, one that had carved a deep, jagged scar into her heart. She hadn't expected to relive it now, not while reading his letters, but it came rushing back with a clarity she couldn't escape. It was late, dusk settling into darkness, when the argument began. They had been at each other's throats for weeks, the distance between them growing wider with each passing day, their once shared laughter replaced by strained silences and brittle words. That night, it all came crashing down. Liam stood by the door, his hands balled into fists at his sides, his face a mixture of frustration and hurt. Olivia could see the pain in his eyes, but it only made her angrier, as if his sadness somehow blamed her, weighed her down even more. "Why won't you just talk to me, Olivia?" Liam's voice was tight, desperate. "Why is it so hard for you to open up? We're falling apart, and you're just shutting me out." Olivia shook her head, her chest tightening. "You don't understand, Liam. You never have." The words felt hollow as they left her mouth, but she couldn't stop them. She had tried. She had tried so hard to make things work, to fight for them, but the distance between them had grown too vast, too unbridgeable. She looked around their apartment. The space that once felt like home now felt foreign, cold. It was like the walls were closing in on her, pressing her into a corner. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't stay. "Maybe this isn't working anymore," she whispered. But the words felt final, even to her. The look on his face, shock, disbelief, made her want to take it all back, but she couldn't. She had already made up her mind. Liam's voice cracked as he stepped closer. "Olivia, please, don't leave. We can fix this. We can." But she was already picking up her suitcase, her hands trembling as she zipped it shut. "I need to go, Liam. I can't do this anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating them both. Olivia turned her back on him, on everything they had built, and walked out the door. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the hallway, each one a reminder that there was no going back. She didn't look back, not once, because if she did, if she saw the look in his eyes, the last piece of her heart would have shattered. The door clicked shut behind her, and in that moment, she knew. It was over. Liam stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he watched Olivia slip away. Each step she took toward the door felt like a piece of him being torn away, and as the suitcase in her hand thudded softly against the floor, it echoed in his mind like a death knell. "Olivia, please," his voice cracked, raw with emotion, but it was too late. The words, desperate and broken, hung uselessly in the air between them. He reached out a hand, almost instinctively, but she didn't turn. Her back was to him, her face a silent mask of determination, and it cut through him deeper than anything she could have said. The silence was suffocating. He wanted to speak, to beg, to make her understand what he couldn't put into words, but the weight of her decision held him in place. The reality of it hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a fight, a temporary break. This was her leaving. Leaving him. Liam's chest tightened, and he closed his eyes, trying to hold onto some shred of control. But it was slipping away, faster than he could grasp it. When he opened his eyes again, she was by the door, her hand already on the handle. The thought of her walking out of this life, his life, was too much to bear. Why? He wanted to scream. Why now? Why us? But he couldn't find the words. Instead, he watched helplessly as Olivia pulled the door open, the cold night air rushing in, the world outside swallowing the space between them. His heart shattered as the door clicked shut behind her, the finality of it ringing in his ears like a death sentence. Alone. She was gone, and he was left standing there, devastated, as the world around him felt like it was crumbling into pieces. Liam sat at his kitchen table, the quiet morning light filtering through the window, casting soft shadows across the room. His fingers hovered over the paper as he thought about what to write, as if trying to summon the words that had been gnawing at him for days. The silence was deafening, a reminder of everything that had changed, everything that had been lost. He sighed, the weight of it all pressing down on him, and began to write. Olivia, he started, the name feeling so familiar, yet so distant now. Every morning, I wonder if today is the day you'll come back. It's a thought that won't leave me. I wake up, and for a split second, I almost forget everything. The silence, the emptiness, it all feels like a bad dream. And then, reality hits. I know you're not here. His hand moved across the paper, the ink flowing as his thoughts spilled out, raw and unfiltered. I don't know how to move on. I keep telling myself I'll be okay, that time will heal the wound, but it never feels like enough. Every day is the same. Another day spent waiting, hoping that somehow you'll walk through that door and everything will go back to the way it was. But deep down, I know better. He paused, his eyes drifting to the empty space across the room, where she used to sit. The chair now felt like a ghost, a reminder of everything that had been. I miss you. I miss the way you'd laugh, the way you'd talk about the smallest things like they were the most important. I miss the way you made everything feel lighter, brighter. Without you, everything seems heavy, as if the world has lost its color. The pen paused for a moment, Liam taking a breath before he finished the letter. I don't know if you'll ever come back, Olivia, but I'll keep waiting. Because even though it hurts, I can't seem to let go. He set the pen down, staring at the letter as if trying to will it to reach her. His heart ached as he folded the paper, sealing it with the familiar wax. Another day, another letter. And still, the hope lingered that one day, she would come back. Olivia's hands trembled as she turned the page, her eyes scanning the next letter. The words blurred before her, the weight of each sentence pressing down on her chest, tightening her throat. She wiped her eyes, but it didn't stop the tears from falling, soft, quiet, and steady. She hadn't realized just how much she had been holding in until now. Each letter, each word, felt like a raw thread pulling at her heart. Liam's pain was laid bare in every letter, his hope, his longing, his love, shining through in ways she never could have imagined. She had thought she knew him, thought she understood the depth of what they had shared, but reading these letters, she was confronted with something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. I miss you. It felt like an echo of her own unspoken truth, a truth she had buried for so long, trying to convince herself that she was better off moving on. But now, as the letters unraveled in her hands, that denial began to crumble. She missed him too. She always had. Tears welled in her eyes again, blurring the ink on the page as her chest tightened with the weight of everything she had walked away from. The quiet ache in her heart grew louder with each letter, each one a quiet confession of his feelings, of a love that never faded, even after all this time. She wasn't sure how much longer she could read without falling apart, but she couldn't stop. She needed to know, needed to feel the full weight of his love, his pain. The floodgates had opened, and now there was no turning back. Each letter was a step closer to understanding the depth of what she had lost, and what perhaps, just perhaps, she could still have. With every letter Olivia read, Liam's words cut through her like a slow, steady ache. His love for her was unwavering, a constant thread woven through the fabric of each sentence. But beneath that love, there was something else, a deep, undeniable regret that colored every word, every confession. I know I should have done more. I should have fought harder for us, for you, but I didn't. And now, all I have left are these words. I'm sorry. The regret in his words was like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with its intensity. She could feel the sincerity in each sentence, the rawness of his apology, even though time had passed and the distance between them had only grown. His heartache was as real as her own. Olivia wiped the tears that had welled up in her eyes, blinking through the blur. She had always known Liam loved her, but this was more than love. It was a longing that stretched across days, across months, years even, and in every letter, he had poured that love out, only to be met with silence. a silence that echoed louder than words ever could. I never meant to hurt you. I was so afraid of losing you that I pushed you away without realizing it. The truth of his regret hit her like a storm, twisting something deep inside of her. She had been hurt, yes, but so had he. In his words, she could see the weight of the decisions they'd both made, the things they had both failed to say. She had walked away, yes, but so had he, in his own way. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I'll spend every day hoping you will. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Olivia could only sit there, letting them settle into her heart. They had both been lost, both caught in their own fears and missteps. But his love had never wavered, and neither had his regret. In those letters, Liam had given her more than just words. He had given her a piece of his soul, his love, his remorse, his hope for something that might never be. The day was overcast, the kind of gray sky that made everything feel still, almost suspended in time. Liam sat at his desk, the faint hum of the world outside filtering in through the window, but inside, it was as if everything had gone quiet. His fingers hovered above the paper, as if the weight of what he was about to write was too heavy to bear. He had written hundreds of letters, each one filled with his heartache, his regrets, but this one felt different. He picked up the pen and began to write, each word feeling like it was drawn from the deepest part of him. Olivia, he wrote, the name familiar yet distant now, as if the passage of time had stretched it too far. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back. But I want you to know something I should have told you a long time ago. Liam paused, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't know if she would ever read these words, didn't know if she'd ever understand the depth of his feelings. But he had to say them, even if it was just for himself. He leaned over the paper again, the ink flowing freely now. Even if you never forgive me, I want you to be happy. Always. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything. All the pain, all the longing, all the years spent trying to figure out what had gone wrong. In this one letter, he was giving her everything he had left to give. His forgiveness, his regrets, and the only thing he truly wanted for her, peace. He set the pen down, staring at the words as they lay there, stark and final on the page. There was nothing else to say, nothing more he could offer. He had loved her, he always would, and in the end, that was all he could give her. With a heavy heart, he sealed the letter, unsure if it would ever find its way to her, but knowing, deep down, that it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had let go. What mattered was that he had finally allowed her to be free. As he placed the letter in the stack, he whispered softly to the empty room, I hope you find the happiness you deserve, Olivia. Olivia's breath was shallow as she turned the final page, her hands trembling with anticipation, her heart racing. She had read every single letter, each one revealing more of Liam's soul, his love, his regret. But now, as she faced the last one, a strange feeling settled over her, something between fear and hope. The stack of letters, each one carefully sealed and dated, had taken her on a journey through time, unraveling emotions she had long buried. But this was the end. The last letter. The final piece of the puzzle that had been her and Liam. Her fingers hovered over the envelope, the familiar wax seal staring back at her. Day 365. Her pulse quickened as she slowly peeled the seal back, her mind racing with the thought of what it might contain. She had already learned so much, felt so much, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for the final words, the ones that would bring everything full circle. With a steadying breath, Olivia unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the first few words. Her vision blurred for a moment, tears welling in her eyes once again, the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid crashing down on her all at once. Liam's words, even in their simplicity, hit her like a wave, sweeping over her and pulling her under. She had known it would hurt. She had known it would stir up memories she hadn't dared face. But now, with the last letter in her hands, she understood something more. She understood the depth of his love, the strength of his regret, and the quiet ache of a heart that had never truly let her go. As she read on, her hands shook more violently, her breath catching in her throat, knowing that this letter, this final message, was the last piece of their story. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she read the first few words of the last letter, the final letter from Liam. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, each sentence pulling her deeper into the memories of what had once been. Olivia, his words began, simple and familiar, but they already felt like a quiet ache in her heart. If you're reading this, it means I've failed. I've failed to tell you how much I love you, how much I've always loved you. I've failed to show you, to be the person you deserved, the person who could make you feel seen, understood. I don't know if I'll ever be able to find the right words, but I hope, somehow, these reach you. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the lines, her heart squeezing tight. She had never realized how much Liam had carried, how much he had held onto over the years. The guilt, the love, the endless longing. I don't know what tomorrow holds, or if we will ever find our way back to each other. But know this, Olivia, I will always love you, even if it's from a distance, even if I never get to hold you again. You will always have a piece of my heart, no matter where life takes us. The tears came without warning, spilling down her cheeks as she read on, the finality of it all crashing over her. She could feel his pain in every word, every sentence, and yet, beneath it all, there was a love so deep, so pure, that it left her breathless. If you ever find it in your heart to forgive me, I will wait. But if not, if this is the end, I will still wish you nothing but happiness. Because that's all I've ever wanted for you, Olivia. Always. Olivia's hands shook as she finished reading the letter, the finality of it sinking in. She stared at the paper, unable to form words, her chest heavy with everything she had just read, everything she had just felt. She had come here to find answers, but what she found was something deeper, something she hadn't been ready for. Liam's love, his regret, his hope. They were all here, in these simple words, and she realized, in that moment, that she had never truly understood how much he had loved her until now. Liam sat alone in the quiet of his room, the light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. He looked at the paper in front of him, his hand hovering over the pen. This was it, the last one. He had written so many letters, each one filled with hope and regret. But this one felt different. It was the end, the final attempt, the last chance to say everything he had held back. He took a deep breath and began to write, each word carrying the weight of everything he had felt over the years. Olivia, he started, his heart pounding in his chest. This is my last letter. If you're reading this, then maybe there's still a chance. I know I've made mistakes, too many to count, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. But if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, then maybe there's something left, something I've missed. Maybe we haven't lost everything yet. He paused for a moment, his mind racing. His hand trembled as he wrote the next sentence, each word laced with the fear of what might come next. I'll be at our cafe at sunset. If you come, I'll know that there's still hope for us. If you don't, I'll understand. I'll know. It's truly over. Liam closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breath. This was it. No more letters. No more hoping. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and final. He folded the paper carefully, sealing it with the familiar wax. This time, he didn't feel the usual sense of peace that came with writing. This time, it was different. This time, it felt like everything was on the line. As he set the letter down, a single tear slipped down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He had given everything he could. Now, all he could do was wait. He whispered softly to the empty room, "Please, Olivia, please come." Olivia sat in her car, the engine idling quietly, her fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. Her eyes darted between the dashboard and the view outside, watching as the sky slowly began to darken, the orange glow of sunset creeping across the horizon. The clock on the dashboard ticked away, each second passing like an eternity. She couldn't bring herself to move. The cafe was just up ahead, its warm glow inviting, but she had stayed in her car, parked across the street, unable to take that final step. Her heart raced, torn between the memory of everything she had once shared with Liam and the fear of what might happen if she walked through that door. Her gaze flickered to the clock again. The sun was dipping lower, the edges of the sky painted in shades of pink and gold. Almost sunset, just a few more minutes, and then it would be too late. Olivia swallowed hard, her throat tight. She could feel the pull, the weight of the decision she had to make. To go inside, to face Liam, to see him after all this time. Or to turn away, knowing that perhaps they were both too broken to fix what had been lost. She glanced back at the cafe, the sight of it stirring a flood of memories. The laughter, the moments shared, the promises they had made to each other. And now, here she was, still torn, still unsure. The clock ticked again. The sun was almost gone. The choice, the moment, was slipping away. Olivia's breath caught as she looked back at the fading light. Was it too late? Would he still be waiting for her? Or had she waited too long, kept him in limbo for too long? With one last glance at the clock, she opened the door, her heart racing faster than ever before. The time for waiting was over. It was time to find out what came next. Olivia stood in front of the cafe, her breath shallow, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The door was just a few steps away, but it felt like miles. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat loud and insistent, urging her forward, yet her feet remained frozen, unwilling to take that final step. The warm glow of the cafe was inviting, but it felt like a world apart from where she stood. Everything inside of her screamed to go, to see him, to end this uncertainty. But another part of her held back, weighed down by the fear of what that moment might bring. What if he's moved on? The thought slithered into her mind like a cold whisper, making her hesitate. What if I've already ruined everything beyond repair? She glanced through the cafe window, her eyes scanning the empty tables, the soft hum of quiet conversation coming from within. But there was no sign of him. Would he even be there? Or had he given up? A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the culmination of everything they had been through, everything they had lost, everything they had never said. Should I go? The question echoed in her mind, growing louder with every passing second. She wanted to run, to turn away, to pretend none of this was happening. But deep down, she knew that the longer she stood there, the harder it would be to face him, or to walk away. She closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath, and tried to steady herself. The sun had set now, and the sky was fading to deep purple, the darkness creeping in. There was no more time to think, no more time to hesitate. She had to decide. Her hand reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling. Was this the moment she'd been waiting for? Or the one that would tear everything apart? The weight of it all pressed down on her, and for a moment, she thought she might turn away. But then, her hand tightened around the door. It was time. In a split second, the hesitation that had held Olivia in place shattered like glass. Without thinking, her feet moved faster than her mind could catch up, and she found herself running, her pulse pounding in her ears, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The door behind her swung open, but it was as if the world outside had come alive, urging her forward, pulling her through the street with a force she couldn't ignore. Her heart raced, the air cold against her skin, her thoughts a blur. She ran past the rows of quiet buildings, the sound of her footsteps the only thing that seemed real. Every step felt like a leap, every breath an answer to a question she'd been too afraid to ask until now. She didn't know where she was going. All that mattered was the overwhelming feeling inside of her, the need to move, to make a choice, to face the truth of everything that had been left unsaid, to find him. The world around her seemed to slow, but her feet never stopped, her legs carrying her further down the street, closer to the place she needed to be. Her chest tightened as she rounded the corner and saw the cafe in the distance, the lights glowing warmly from the windows, just as they had so many times before. But this time, there was no hesitation, no turning back. The door was just ahead, the moment was here, and as she reached for the handle, she felt a single tear slip down her cheek. The door opened, the warmth of the cafe enveloping her, and for the first time in so long, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. Liam sat at their old table by the window, his fingers drumming nervously on the rim of his coffee cup. The cafe, once a place of shared laughter and quiet conversations, now felt painfully empty. The warmth of the room did little to ease the chill settling deep in his bones. His eyes flickered to the clock on the wall, his stomach tightening as the minutes ticked by. The sun had long set, and the evening shadows stretched across the room, making everything feel too still. He hadn't expected her to show up right away. He knew the weight of time, how it had changed everything, how it made the simplest things seem like monumental decisions. Still, with every passing second, his hope faded just a little more, like the sun slipping below the horizon. Liam glanced down at his watch, checking the time for what felt like the 100th time. His heart raced as the minutes seemed to crawl by, each one heavier than the last. He had written so many letters, each one filled with all the things he never got the chance to say. And now this, the final one. He had told himself he'd be okay, that he could handle whatever came next, but the truth was, he wasn't sure. His eyes drifted back to the door, his breath catching in his throat for the briefest of moments as he imagined her walking in. But the door stayed shut. The bell above it remained silent. He swallowed hard, the knot in his chest tightening. Maybe she won't come. The thought stung more than he cared to admit, but it was a reality he had to face. Maybe the past was too heavy to carry, too much damage to fix. He ran his hand through his hair, staring down at the letter he had written, the one that would be the end of it all, whether they could rebuild or whether it was truly over. Liam shifted in his seat, glancing up again, his gaze lingering on the door, almost willing it to open. He had to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she would walk through it. Just as Liam stood up, his hand brushing against the back of his chair, the weight of disappointment pressing down on him, a voice, soft, familiar, stopped him in his tracks. Liam. The sound of her name, whispered with hesitation, pierced through the quiet of the cafe like a breath of fresh air. His heart jolted in his chest, and for a moment, he didn't move. He couldn't. He turned slowly, his breath catching as his eyes landed on Olivia, standing at the entrance. Her face was a mixture of uncertainty and something he couldn't quite place, but the way she stood there, just a few steps away, made everything else fade into the background. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if time had stopped, the world outside the cafe continuing on, but inside, everything hung suspended in the weight of the moment. Liam's voice cracked as he took a step toward her. "Olivia, you came." His heart raced, but he couldn't stop the relief that flooded him. He had waited so long, written so many letters, and now, finally, she was here. He didn't know what would come next, but in this moment, in this breath, all that mattered was that she had walked in, and everything he had hoped for seemed to pulse with a new light. Olivia took a deep breath, her voice barely more than a whisper as she stepped further into the cafe. The air between them felt thick with everything unsaid, everything that had been left to simmer for far too long. Her chest rose and fell with the weight of what she was about to say, the words she had held back for so long finally pushing their way to the surface. "Liam." Her voice caught, breathless, the vulnerability in it more than she had ever let herself show. His eyes widened, disbelief flickering across his face. He hadn't expected this, not after everything. Not after the years, the distance, the silence. Olivia met his gaze, her hands trembling as they clutched the letter she had carried with her, the last one. "I read them all. Every single one." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the silence that had settled between them. Each letter, each confession, each plea had found its way to her heart, and now, standing in front of him, she could feel the weight of it all, the pain, the regret, the love he had poured into those pages. Liam stood frozen, his heart racing, the realization hitting him like a wave. She had read them. She had read everything he had written, every emotion he had bared. And here she was, standing in front of him, the truth of it all unfolding in the space between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The room was filled with the soft hum of quiet conversations, but to them, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. Everything that had kept them apart, all the misunderstandings, the years of silence, seemed to vanish, leaving only the raw, unspoken bond that still tethered them together. A long pause stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and emotions too vast to articulate. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she held his gaze, every inch of her waiting for something. Anything, to break the silence that felt almost too heavy to bear. And then, just as it seemed the moment might stretch on forever, something in Liam shifted. His lips trembled at first, as if unsure whether he was allowed to smile, to hope. But then, slowly, the corners of his mouth lifted, the smile fragile at first, before it bloomed fully, a quiet, tender curve that reached his eyes. Tears welled up in his eyes, shimmering as they caught the dim cafe light, threatening to spill over. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't need to. They were the tears of relief, of joy, of everything that had built up over the years and finally found its release. His chest rose and fell with a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I thought I'd lost you forever," Liam said, his voice thick with emotion. The words came out in a quiet, choked whisper, as if he had to force them through the lump in his throat. Olivia's chest tightened as she saw the rawness in his face, the way he allowed himself to be vulnerable, the way his heart bared itself in front of her. She had never imagined that he could still look at her like this, still care for her with this depth, this openness. His smile deepened as he took a tentative step toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Olivia, I've been waiting, hoping, but I never thought I'd get to see you again." For a moment, they both stood there, lost in the intensity of it all, each one realizing that the years of silence, the distance, the pain, had somehow led them here. A smile, tears, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't lost everything after all. As the cafe fell silent around them, their eyes met one last time, and everything they had been through, everything that had kept them apart, seemed to dissolve into that one shared glance. The weight of the years, the regrets, the pain, gone. Just a quiet, unspoken understanding passed between them, like a promise that maybe it wasn't too late after all. The camera lingered on Liam's face, still soft with that tearful smile, then slowly shifted to Olivia, her eyes brimming with the same quiet hope. They didn't need to speak the words. They had already said everything in the letters, in the silence, in the way they had come back to each other, even after all this time. Voiceover, soft, gentle. Some letters are meant to be read. Some love stories deserve a second chance. As the words echoed in the stillness, the screen slowly faded to black.